Depending on one's perspective of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Anne of Cleves could be seen as either the most unfortunate or the luckiest of them all. Though she was rejected by Henry, she managed to survive the fallout, carve out an independent life, and ultimately outlive all of his other wives. Anne was born on September 22nd, 1515, in the ducal capital of Dusseldorf. She was the second of 3 sisters, with an elder sister, Sibylle, married off at the age of 12 to the Elector of Saxony, and a younger sister, Amalia, who remained a spinster throughout her life. Her brother William inherited their father's duchy. Anne's father, John, was the Duke of Cleves and Count of Mark, though both titles came through his marriage to Maria of Jülichburg. Anne was raised at Berg Castle, on the edge of the city of Xanten, which had, by the time of her birth, evolved from a defensive fortress into a more luxurious palace. Despite her privileged upbringing, Anne did not receive the kind of formal education that many noblewomen in other parts of Europe enjoyed. She could read and write in German, excelled in needlework and tapestry making, and was deeply influenced by the strict religious teachings of her time. Anne's religious upbringing may have varied depending on which parent she spoke with. Her father was a committed Lutheran, heavily influenced by Erasmus, while her mother remained a devout Catholic. In 1527, at the age of 11, Anne was betrothed to Francis, the 9-year-old heir to the Duke of Lorraine. This engagement was part of her father's broader strategy to secure alliances and strengthen his duchy against the growing power of the Habsburg Empire. However, due to Francis's young age, and Anne's as well, the match was called off in 1535. Despite this, Henry VIII would later use the broken betrothal as a justification to annul his own marriage to Anne. By 1538, Henry was once again in search of a wife. His third queen, Jane Seymour, had died in October 1537 after giving birth to his only son, Edward. Henry appeared to have genuinely mourned her passing, as the court remained in mourning until the following spring. Although he entertained his counsel's suggestions about remarrying, he showed little enthusiasm for the idea, and for a time, no real progress was made in securing a new queen. In November, someone mentioned that the Duke of Cleves had 2 eligible daughters, but Henry did not seriously consider the idea until 1538. That same year, Pope Paul III learned of the executions of Henry Pole, 1st Baron Montague, and Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, both accused of plotting to overthrow Henry VIII, despite scant evidence. In response, the Pope reissued Henry's excommunication, further isolating England from Catholic Europe. This development made an alliance with the Protestant Duchy of Cleves even more appealing. Recognising a valuable opportunity, Duke John of Cleves proposed his eldest unmarried daughter, Anne, for the match. Henry, meanwhile, was under increasing pressure from his council to remarry, though he had finally secured the son and heir he had always longed for. Edward, his only other legitimate children, were his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who would one day prove to be formidable rulers. However, with just one male heir, securing a spare was a priority. The idea of an alliance with Cleves and the marriage to Anne was largely the brainchild of Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who saw the union as a way to strengthen England's position against Catholic powers. As a reward for his efforts, Thomas Cromwell was made Lord Great Chamberlain. In 1539, Henry VIII sent 2 staunchly Protestant ambassadors, Nicholas Wotton and Robert Barnes, to the ducal court in Dusseldorf to negotiate a marriage between the king and one of Duke John's daughters, either Anne or her younger sister, Amalia. However, upon their arrival, they found that Duke John had passed away on February 6th, and they were instead greeted by his son and successor, Duke William. William was a deeply devout and serious man with rigid views on female modesty. To the ambassadors' surprise, both Anne and Amalia were dressed in heavy, concealing garments, including a thick habit, gown and veil, making it nearly impossible to discern their faces or figures. When Wotton carefully suggested that Henry wished to see what the women looked like, William sharply retorted, "Would you have them appear naked?" Though William's response seemed extreme, his perspective was not entirely unreasonable. Henry's marriages were notoriously driven by physical attraction, and William likely found such superficial criteria distasteful, especially given the king's history with wives. To resolve the issue, Thomas Cromwell commissioned the renowned artist Hans Holbein to paint portraits of Anne and Amalia, ensuring Henry could judge their appearances before making a decision. Despite the negotiations progressing, Duke William had yet to grant permission for Holbein to paint Anne's portrait. He deliberately delayed the process, forcing Thomas Cromwell to appease Henry by exaggerating Anne's virtues. Cromwell praised her beauty, grace, and virtue, insisting that many people had extolled her charm. He had no choice but to embellish. After all, the marriage had been his idea from the start. In reality, very few people had any clear idea of Anne's appearance. Due to her strict upbringing and her brother's extreme protectiveness, she had rarely been seen without heavy layers of clothing and veils. William, perhaps seeing the dangers of such a marriage, found every possible excuse to dissuade Henry. He argued that his sisters were so virtuous and secluded that they would struggle to adapt to the English court, notorious for its games of passion and flirtation. He also pointed out that the German courts frowned upon women even playing music, suggesting that Anne would find English customs overwhelming. Further, William warned that given Henry's history with wives, any woman who followed in their footsteps would live in constant insecurity and unhappiness. As a final attempt to deter the match, he even claimed that he was far too poor to provide an adequate dowry. When Duke William hesitated over providing a dowry, Henry VIII dismissed the concern, declaring that if Lady Anne was as lovely as everyone claimed, he would marry her without one. This was an offer the financially strained William could not refuse, and he finally agreed to have Anne's portrait painted. Holbein painted Anne face on, an unusual approach for the time, which subtly disguised her long nose. In the portrait she appears demure and youthful, with a serene expression. Her hands are gently clasped in a dignified pose, while her elaborate jewelled gown and headdress emphasise her noble status. Upon seeing the painting, Henry was immediately captivated and declared that Anne was the wife he wanted. Thomas Cromwell, relieved that the negotiations were progressing smoothly, believed everything was on track. However, by the end of August, William recalled Anne's previous betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine. This past engagement required nullification through the ecclesiastical court before she could marry Henry. Fortunately, after thorough inquiries from both England and Cleves, no official pre-contract of marriage was found. With this obstacle cleared, Anne's marriage contract to Henry was officially signed on September 4th, 1539. Since Anne had never travelled by sea, it was decided that she would journey to England over land through Calais, rather than risk the unpredictable Baltic waters. She departed Cleves in early November, but her progress was slow, and she did not reach Calais until December 11th. Meanwhile, Henry VIII was eagerly anticipating his bride's arrival, brimming with excitement, and frequently requesting updates from his ambassadors. They described Anne as tall and slender, with average beauty and a resolute demeanour. However, this description did not align with Henry's usual preference for women, though he was so fixated on his expectations that he dismissed any concerns. On December 27th, Anne finally landed in England, pressing on towards Canterbury just 2 days later, enduring bitter winds and hail along the way. By New Year's Eve, she had arrived at Rochester Abbey, where she was welcomed with a great ceremony. The English court buzzed with anticipation as many lords and ladies vied for a place in the new Queen's household. Despite the exhausting journey, Anne made a strong impression. Her manners were graceful, her demeanour cheerful, and her presence well received. Anne was reportedly eager to compensate for her lack of formal education by learning English as quickly as possible and doing everything in her power to please the king. Not a single person at court had anything negative to say about her manners or appearance. However, her first meeting with Henry VIII would prove to be a disastrous one. Following an old English chivalric tradition, Henry decided to meet his bride in disguise. According to this custom, the bride was expected to see through the disguise and recognise her true love. Unfortunately, no one seemed to consider the fact that Anne, unfamiliar with English courtly traditions, would have no idea what was happening. And even if someone had warned Henry, it's unlikely he would have listened. Anne was watching a bear baiting match from her window when Henry, dressed in a ragged cloak, burst into the room, claiming to be a messenger with a gift from the king. To make matters worse, at this point Anne did not understand English. Without warning, Henry grabbed her and kissed her. Rather than swooning into his arms, as he may have expected, Anne was understandably horrified. After all, from her perspective, an overweight, unkempt stranger had just barged in and kissed her without consent. Against her will and unable to understand the language, Anne recoiled from Henry's unexpected embrace, turning back toward the window, likely shaken and unsure of what to do. She was a foreign noblewoman who had just been forcibly kissed in her own chambers, and no one had stepped in to stop it. Was this how she was going to be treated in England? Henry was constantly surrounded by sycophants, courtiers trained to gaze at him adoringly and reassure him that, despite his aging body, worsening gout, ever-growing stomach, notorious temper, and a history of disposing of wives, he was still the most desirable prince in all of Christendom. For a woman to recoil from him, let alone one he intended to marry, was likely the first time such a thing had ever happened to him. As he had done many times before, Henry chose not to see the rejection as a fault of his own, but rather as a flaw in Anne. A mere few minutes earlier he had eagerly embraced her, but now, having had his ego bruised, he suddenly found her repulsive. Henry stormed out of the room but returned shortly after, now dressed in full regal attire. Poor Anne, likely mortified upon realising what had happened, sank to her knees in greeting. Henry pulled her up and kissed her on the mouth in the English tradition. They shared a halting conversation with the help of a translator and ate supper together, but the damage had already been done. Henry's pride had been wounded beyond repair. He had brought a gift for his new queen, but in his haste to leave he forgot to give it to her. Someone had to return later to present it on his behalf. Furious, Henry pulled his courtiers aside and declared, "I like her not. She is nothing as well as she was spoken of." Predictably, no one dared to contradict him. However, outside his circle, opinions were more balanced. The French diplomat Mathieu de Marillac described Anne as of middling beauty, more generous than his later assessment of Catherine Howard, whom Henry saw as stunning. Desperate to avoid marriage, Henry sought a legal loophole. He summoned Anne, demanding she swear she had no prior marital commitments, perhaps hoping she'd refuse. Instead, Anne compiled without hesitation. An annulment risked the German alliance, something Henry couldn't afford. Despite his outrage, Henry never blamed Hans Holbein, the painter of Anne's portrait. He continued commissioning Holbein, suggesting the artist hadn't deceived him. With no alternative, Henry and Anne married on January 6, 1540. The next day, Henry claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage, citing Anne's appearance. Ironically, rumours of his own impotence would haunt him for years. Henry was quick to insist that his failure to consummate the marriage was not due to any physical inability, claiming he had experienced not one, but 2 nocturnal emissions. A desperate attempt to assert his virility. Anne couldn't have missed her husband's disdain. The court was filled with gossip, and she had no allies except the ambassadors from Cleves. Even her ladies-in-waiting had been replaced, including a young Catherine Howard. When asked if she believed she was still a maid, Anne reportedly said, "How can I be a maid and sleep every night with the king? He kisses me goodnight and bids me farewell in the morning." When asked if that was all, she confirmed it and added that she knew she was not with child. Despite lacking formal education, Anne understood reproduction and knew Henry had not consummated their marriage. But she also knew better than to anger the king. By June 24th, Henry had enough. Under the pretext of a plague outbreak, she was sent to Richmond Palace, the beginning of the end of her short reign as queen. Considering Henry's notorious hypochondria, he panicked at a mere sneeze. It's unlikely he'd stay in the city if a real plague outbreak had occurred. Yet, he was publicly seen on the Thames heading to Lambeth Palace, where Catherine Howard was staying. Anne must have been terrified. Henry's first move in discarding a wife was physical distance. Her fears peaked on July 6th, when royal commissioners arrived at night. The moment they entered, she fainted. Visions of trumped-up charges and execution surely flashed through her mind. But Anne's fate was different. The commissioners assured her that Henry simply wished to clarify their marriage's legality. Conveniently, a prior contract with the Duke of Lorraine had just been discovered, rendering her marriage invalid. Playing her part well, Anne feigned sorrow but quickly agreed to the dissolution. In return, she received a generous settlement, £4,000 a year, estates, jewels, and the honorary title of the king's sister. In the end, she secured the best outcome of any of Henry's wives: wealth, freedom, and most importantly, her head. Anne was now ranked just below the future queen and the king's daughters. To solidify her status, Henry publicly declared her a virgin, free to remarry, despite using the opposite claim against her days earlier. But Anne had no reason to object. The wealth and freedom she gained were far more valuable than a crown. On July 9, 1540, Henry's clergy annulled the marriage, and Anne accepted without protest, signing in the king's presence. She wrote to her brother, Duke William of Cleves, explaining her decision to stay in England, where her land grants depended on her residence. She had also grown fond of her new home. Publicly, William expressed relief, but privately, he was outraged by Henry's treatment of Anne. He feared she might be persecuted for her Protestant faith, though that never happened. Anne, far from bitter, embraced her new life, indulging in fashion, entertainment, and sports. Surprisingly, she and Henry remained friends, and he continued to shower her with gifts. She also grew close to Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Unlike many discarded queens, Anne not only survived, but thrived. One of the few to leave the English throne with her dignity, fortune, and life intact. Anne developed a warm friendship with Princess Mary, but was especially fond of young Elizabeth, who, unlike her brother, received little attention. Feeling a maternal instinct she knew would never be fulfilled, Anne asked Henry if Elizabeth could visit, and he agreed. Elizabeth became a frequent guest at Richmond Palace, where Anne showered her with affection. During Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, Anne retired to the countryside, enjoying estate life and even building a private kitchen to experiment with cooking. However, not everyone involved in Anne's failed marriage fared well. Thomas Cromwell, who arranged the match, was blamed for misleading Henry about Anne's appearance. Seizing the opportunity, Henry had Cromwell executed on July 28, 1540. His beheading, meant to be merciful, was botched, requiring 2 strokes. Years later, after Catherine Howard's execution in 1542, Anne's brother, Duke William of Cleves, reached out to Henry regarding her well-being, proving Anne's remarkable ability to remain in Henry's favour despite their short-lived marriage. There was speculation that Anne might remarry Henry, as she remained popular in England. However, Henry dismissed the idea, likely to Anne's relief. Politically savvy, she maintained favour by publicly praising Henry, even inspiring flattering pamphlets. Though he reassured her she would always be his beloved sister, she never regained her status. When Henry married Catherine Parr, Anne wittily remarked, "Madame Parr is taking a great burden on herself." With Henry's attention elsewhere, she withdrew from public life. After his death in 1547, her residences were revoked, and she relocated to Hever Castle, dedicating herself to renovations. During Edward VI's reign, Anne stayed out of the public eye, but frequently complained about financial disputes. After his death, she re-emerged, congratulating Mary Tudor on her marriage to Philip of Spain. On September 28, 1553, at Mary's coronation, Anne rode in a place of honour, her final public appearance before permanently leaving court life. As England returned to Catholicism under Queen Mary, Anne willingly converted. Mary praised this decision, though Anne's religious background was complex. Her father was Lutheran, her mother Catholic. She likely reconciled both faiths. Anne faced suspicion after Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. Mary, fearing Elizabeth's involvement, suspected Anne due to their close bond. The imperial ambassador claimed Anne sought support for Elizabeth, but there's no evidence she conspired against Mary. After 1554, she was never summoned to court again. By 1557, Anne's health declined, possibly due to cancer. Mary allowed her to move to Chelsea Old Manor, where she spent her final days. In her will, she generously provided for her servants with money, jewels, and dowries. One of her final requests was that rents from her lands be used to settle any debts. Anne of Cleves passed away on July 16, 1557, as the last of Henry VIII's wives to die. Despite past suspicions, Queen Mary valued her as a dear friend and ensured she received a royal funeral. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey with a full Catholic service, her tomb draped in cloth of gold. Though Queen Mary commissioned a grand tomb, it was never completed. Anne may not have been a queen for long, but she was intelligent and incredibly fortunate. She handled Henry VIII's annulment with grace, despite legal and political challenges in a foreign language. Quickly learning English, she adapted, thrived, and won the people's respect. Of all Henry's wives, Anne had the best fate, living independently, amassing wealth, and forming lasting friendships. She may not have ruled, but she secured something just as valuable: freedom, respect, and happiness.